it is clear that the U.S. has been nervous about the rise of China, which is true in Europe and a lot of other places, due to a traditional mistrust of China. You know, it's an authoritarian country, it's a communist country, et cetera. And, you know, it's other questions, sort of, you know, why is China having to spend so much money on military? It's not very transparent. It's not clear how much money is being spent on the military. The U.S. has been nervous about China's investment in natural resources in, you know, Latin America and Africa, as well as in Asia. And so it seems to be throwing its economic weight around, both in terms of state-owned enterprises and its new sovereign wealth funds. It hasn't been cooperating on issues that the U.S. sees as being very important for its strategic view globally, say on Myanmar or the Sudan. I understand that Steven Spielberg is now not even going to be an advisor to the Olympics because of his view of Sudan. And there's also this criticism of the rapid and the unbalanced rise of China. And this isn't just and this is what we usually hear about with the criticism of China. It's an unfair trader, manipulating exchange rates. But, you know, the argument would be it's not just the bilateral surplus of $275 billion in 2007, but the fact that the U.S., for every dollar exports it makes to China, it imports $4. And so this has been a target of dispute. So, in short, my argument here is that Asia is a high priority, that Asian economic dynamism and its implications demand a concrete and a proactive U.S. strategy. It also presents numerous political, human rights-related, and strategic incentives to cooperate, and that we'd argue, and what we will argue, is that economic integration trend in Asia offers a number of win-win possibilities that U.S. needs to embrace in developing a cohesive approach. And this is not all intuitive. I mean, it has been in the past, for example, that the U.S. has strongly opposed any movements towards economic integration in Asia. Okay. So let's talk about this integration stuff. Economic integration, if we gauge it anyway by trade and foreign direct investment, has been rising considerably, and it's been essentially market-led. And this is why we call it regionalization. I've been accused of being too trendy in terminology there, but regionalization just means they're trading more with each other. So at the same time you're integrating with the global marketplace, you're also integrating with yourselves more, right? This is a term that's being used increasingly. There's a new thing out by the World Bank on the East Asian Renaissance, et cetera, and this is a term that's become fairly standard. The reasons for this, you have macro explanations. Asia's just growing a lot faster than other countries. And so you tend to trade more with, if you're growing faster and these countries are growing faster, you're going to trade more with each other, right? That's, so through the income effect, you'd see rising integration. But there's also a micro explanation, right? A price-related one where you have more rapid liberalization taking place in Asia than elsewhere. And this idea of value chains and multinational corporation network building in the region, which is also leading to this rise in economic integration. So if you look at this this trend in, this is intra-regional trade of these 15 major East Asian countries, you'll see that by 2005, not one of them traded less than 40% with the region. In other words, you see many of them, I think the average is 58%. But still, all of these countries are seeing generally a major upward trend. Now, some of them are the ones that are sort of going up and down. Brunei is about oil, and the transitional economies are kind of exaggerated. You'll see Myanmar, for example, you see a really big upswing, and the reason being that it's the U.S. boycott of Myanmar. But it's clear that what we see is this trend that is clearly going to be upward sloping. Another thing that we see is there has been a rising symmetry in terms of economic business cycles in the region. Now, in Europe, we're very preoccupied with this idea of symmetry. We say, well, is the euro really an optimum currency? Or in other words, should continental Europe really have one currency? And the big question is, well, if they're symmetric, they should. Then you don't have a problem with monetary policy, for example. If you're all booming at the same time, well, then having a contractionary monetary policy would make sense. And the opposite if you're in a recession. But what happens if part of the region is booming and part is not? How do you do that? So, it's often been used as sort of a characteristic. What makes a region? Right? How integrated is Europe? And if you look at this for Asia, you see actually a dramatic rise in this symmetry. Rana notes that this is a result, empirically shows that this is a result of this increase in interregional trade, but also intra-industry trade, which is sort of characterized by this product upgrading, and the fact that you've got this rising sophistication of these products. I want to mention, however, that this is still being driven by final demand in the OECD. It's not. I really don't buy so much this decoupling process. We can talk about a lot. I know the IMF is really off on the decoupling, but I'm not sure that's all that convincing. But we are seeing this trend. And if you look at these business correlations, I mean, this is a paper I published with a colleague of mine, Ganesha and Wignaraja. And this is just to give you an idea of what the growth path looks like of GDP in the region. If you look before the crisis, if you look before 1997, you see a lot of all these countries are going off in different ways. But as we move towards the post-crisis phase, or during the crisis and post-crisis, you can see that those bands are tightening. Now, one way of sort of trying to check with this is just to run correlations, which we did, say, from the first quarter of 1994 to the first quarter of 2007. And very interestingly, if you correlate, for example, China's business cycle with the region, prior to the crisis, it was statistically insignificant and negative, actually, meaning going the opposite way. And none of the countries actually had a statistically significant correlation. So that's one way of looking at those lines going all over the place to show that we don't have a statistically significant from zero correlation. If you do this after the crisis, and of course it's hard to define when you want to say the crisis was over, but if you say the crisis was over in the first quarter, began to start to phase out in the first quarter of 1998, and you took this to the recent data, they're all statistically significant and high. I mean, these are much higher than the EU numbers, for example, if you look at that. So it's a very interesting trend. So what we're seeing after the crisis in particular is this big rise in regional integration and a big rise in economic symmetry of the region. So you're seeing this regional economy, if you will, that it's growing. Now, regionalism, which is the formal aspect of economic integration. By regionalism, I mean these free trade areas and such. It's unique in Asia, I'd argue, because it's being driven by regionalization rather than vice versa. Usually, we see, like in the European case, we saw the European Payments Union, the European Economic Community, etc., and that sort of discrimination that was imposed led to a big increase in interregional trade and investment. In Asia, it's just the opposite. You've got this rise in regionalism that's being market-led, and it seems like the regionalization that is driving this desire to facilitate it through regionalism. And that is a very different process. And I would argue this is reason why, say, for the United States, you'd be less inclined to worry about a fortress Asia than you would a fortress Europe, because the inkling here, the motivation here is to facilitate the market rather than go against it. Right? It's the flag-following trade. Prior to 2000, there were no significant free trade areas in Asia. There were some that were just really political documents that had some aspects of free trade to them. Even the ASEAN Free Trade Area, which was technically signed in 1992, was a very long way from being implemented. And today there are many. If we looked at the growth, we see it being fairly exponential. And here we're just looking at the quantity of agreements. If you look at the quality, they're much deeper. Right? In 1990, all we saw there were the ASEAN Accords, and the ASEAN Accords were essentially zero. In other words, you had, for example, free trade in snow plows in Southeast Asia. And, Southeast Asia sort of was on the equator. There really wasn't a big demand for those, so it was really just pretty superficial. So you've got this increase in depth, and this is really different. Another thing is that you've got a lot of internal, you've got these, not just ASEAN itself, which is a regional organization, but you're having these bilaterals that are swinging across the region. This was sort of coined by Jagdish Bhagwati, called it the spaghetti bowl, right? Which, I don't know why they always pick on Italian terms, right? So when I talked about best practice in regionalism, I try to talk about the spaghetti effect, right? The lasagna effect, where, spaghetti bowls going up, but lasagna would be nice and well done. Anyway, in Asia, they don't call it the spaghetti bowl effect. They call it the Asian noodle bowl effect. And What we see is a lot of this, and Singapore, of course, has been particularly promiscuous in scoring these agreements, right? It has 13 of them. Some of them, by the way, are deeper in terms of integration than ASEAN is itself. It has 13, and 5 of them are cross-regional, including with the United States. Okay? Outside of that, I mean, cross-regional, there's almost nothing. Okay? I see here we've got some, for example, Indonesia does have a cross-regional agreement, but, you know, free trade with Iran, which is that agreement, isn't really that important since, you know, they do 1% of their trade with each other, and they both, you know, has to do with oil. So we're seeing this is characteristic too. We're seeing not only within the region, we're seeing some that's going outside the region, and we're seeing a lot of the spaghetti bowl stuff. I do a lot of work on ASEAN, and it's very interesting to see how that ASEAN has progressed over time. It's unfortunately we don't have that much time to go into it, but it certainly has been the most ambitious. It's gone from that free trade area to the decision to create an ASEAN economic community, and with all that baggage, right, of being an economic community. And what they want to do, and it's specifically written, is create a single market and production base. Just when everyone was saying, how are we going to do that by 2020, which was when it was first conceived 4 years ago, when they formally agreed to launch the ASEAN Economic Community in January of last year, they said they would do it by 2015, right? So they moved it up by 5 years. So that doesn't leave a lot of time, and that will be significant later, I think. I think that it's important, ASEAN, not just because, you know, I find ASEAN very intriguing, and it's the oldest of these regional groupings. It's also the core of any of these Pan-Asian initiatives that are taking place. It's the core of the ASEAN +3, it's the core of APEC, it's the core of the East Asian Summit, and that's likely to stay. So I think a U.S. target on ASEAN is going to be important when we look at Asian regionalism. All right, so let's look at Asian regionalism in the U.S. Directly. If we look at the real sector stakes, we're looking at trade and investment to start off with. Asia is already a very important trade and foreign direct investment partner. In other words, foreign direct investment generally, the U.S. investing in ASEAN, even though recently the Temasek of the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Singapore is bailing out a lot of U.S. banks and investment funds, so it's kind of interesting that's going the other way. And the argument here would be is that if you've got growth is very robust in Asia relative to the rest of the world, you've got greater liberalization, this is going to continue. Okay, so this has happened in the past, and it's something we could forecast easily for the future. Just looking at some recent numbers that I put together, if we looked at the trade and foreign direct investment, I actually think this is kind of interesting. But if you compare ASEAN to China, well, first of all, Singapore, which is the biggest trader with the U.S. and ASEAN, actually has a trade deficit with the United States. Everybody else has a surplus. And ASEAN trades only about less than half of what the U.S. trades with China. But interestingly, exports to ASEAN are essentially as much as they are to China, 60 billion compared to 65 billion. So they're very similar. So if you want to think of the terms of, well, we're interested in Asia for export markets, I mean, ASEAN is very important. What is even more startling, and I had to look at this number a few times, if you look at the U.S. published figures of foreign direct investment abroad, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, investment in ASEAN comes to $99 billion in 2006, which is 4 times as much as it is in China. So there's big talk about, China's becoming the workplace of the world. It's been in all the papers constantly about how much foreign direct investment is going in China. It's still true that the U.S. invests 4 times as much in ASEAN than it does in China, and about 11 times as much as it does in India, even though India has been getting this also increasingly being looked at. Now, most of this is about Singapore. Most of U.S. investment in ASEAN is through Singapore, $60 billion, which is 3 times what it is in China, which is interesting since there's about 4 million people in Singapore, and there are more than that in China. Okay. If Asian regionalism were to become inward-looking, like a fortress Asia, this could be an important blow to U.S. trade and trade and investment directly, as well as having negative implications for Asian growth. But I don't think that's a likely outcome. As a matter of fact, I think it's pretty much impossible. I mean, if you look at the ASEAN declarations, every single one of them, unlike any other I've seen, always focuses on outward orientation and the need to not do this. Okay? Even a lot of their documents, some of their liberalization is directly liberalization. Okay, we'll do this first for the ASEAN countries, and then we'll do this for others. So I don't think that's a problem. However, the U.S. still could suffer from trade and investment diversion, right? What we usually talk about is that when you have a free trade area, you're discriminating in favor of your partners and against outsiders, and the U.S. would be an outsider, all right? So you ask yourself the question, how important would this effect be? This is another question in that paper I did with Ganeshan Wignaraja. And what we did is we sort of came up with 6 scenarios using a fairly standard computational general equilibrium model to sort of gauge what the economic effects would be. I'll talk about some of the problems with these models. So what we did is we looked first at a fragmented scenario, which is essentially what's going on right now. You've got ASEAN that's deepening. You've got the bilaterals that are taking place. So if nothing changes, this is the trend. This is what we would see. Another one would be the ASEAN plus 3, which would be ASEAN plus a free trade area with China, South Korea, and Japan. Good luck with that one, by the way. An ASEAN plus 6, which would include India, Australia, New Zealand. The ASEAN plus 6 became it's really the components of the East Asian Summit and was included essentially as a Japanese initiative because as a way of, to some degree, of diluting the Chinese influence. If we had an Asia-wide free trade area, all of Asia, an APEC free trade area, which would be the Asia-Pacific, and the U.S. would be included in that, or global trade. And just to look at the numbers, what you'd see is, in red here we've got the U.S. In each and every one of the Asian-specific ones, the U.S. would suffer from trade diversion, and in the ones it's included, perhaps unsurprisingly, it would gain $12 billion through the APEC FTA, $22.8 billion in terms of global free trade. Okay. Now, that's a problem. And right now, we're already looking at the problem with these models. I mean, why would the U.S. spend so much time working at the Doha Development Agenda if it could expect to gain, this is a percentage of GDP, about 1/4 of 1% in terms of GDP gained, right? With all this political movement and everything, if this is really what the gains you could expect, that's not a very strong case for global liberalization or APEC or any of these things. So the idea here is that the U.S. would be negatively affected according to these numbers, but the numbers are small. But again, I'm going to argue that this is a strong downward bias in the model that is particularly problematic when we look at a region like Asia, because the focus is mostly on, say, tariffs. Okay, try to follow me with this. If I have a model that focuses on tariffs, tariffs are important in some places of the world, but they're relatively low in Asia. In ASEAN, the average tariff is, according to the World Bank, 5.5%. That's not very high. Worse, most of these countries, the big traders, by far their biggest export is in electronics, generally in electronics. It's a strong majority in Singapore, Malaysia, the Philippines. It's one of the biggest sector in Indonesia. It's a growing sector in China, et cetera, a very large sector in China. And at least in the ASEAN countries, the tariffs on electronics are essentially zero. So what you'd end up seeing if you had a model that was only based on tariffs, and you said, what's liberalization? You would see nothing, right? Then why, you ask, would it be that why was the U.S. electronics industry so busy lobbying the U.S. government to have a free trade area with Singapore? And the answer would be for reasons that are not included in tariffs. So, and we would argue, and we could talk about this more if you'd like, that in these New Age agreements, that's such a broad coverage, that this could set in motion an effect that would exaggerate these effects. How much, I'm really not sure. Very difficult to gauge. There's some work being done on it. But it would certainly be a much larger effect. So in other words, even though the numbers are small, my guess is they're much bigger than what you think. So the conclusion of this would be you'd want to stay in the game. Okay? It is still, from a strictly economic point of view, an important thing to do. Also, partnership with Asia can help the U.S. achieve its goals in international fora. To give you an example of this, some of you may remember with the Uruguay round, the U.S. twice played chicken with Europe during the Uruguay round, and the Uruguay round died, right? Happened in 1990, December 1990, happened December of 1992. Well, it just so happens that in 1993, President Clinton decided that he would do something with APEC, which hadn't really done anything yet. But he wanted to give it a push. So he invited all the leaders to Blake Island, Washington State, to talk about things. What should we do in terms of economic integration in the future? And some people would say, that it's been hypothesized, that essentially what Clinton was trying to do was just send a message to the Europeans, right? It wasn't for the talk, it was for, they all got together, they took a picture. APEC is really big on pictures, by the way. You always see the pictures, they're all hugging, right? They're all hugging except for the Malaysians that were all really pissed at the US at that time. But they did this, and what Clinton essentially was doing was sending a message to Europe to say, look, if you don't want to do this deal at the Uruguay round, you can have Africa, we'll have Asia, right? And then all of a sudden, Europe gets religion, and the thing goes through. So this is just an example of how these sort of alliances with Asia can be useful. It's also true for the what is it? The ICT agreement at the Singapore Ministerial, etc. That the U.S. can use it. Well, and how the U.S. should do this we'll talk about in the last section. Now, briefly, there's also the idea of the financial area. While less advanced than in the real sector, the emerging financial monetary related issues have become a priority in Asian regional integration. And I'd argue that this makes it unique, because usually you see this sequencing where you start off with the real sector, you start out with trade and goods. Then you go to trade and services, and then probably investment, and then much later you go into financial integration. I mean, if you look at Europe, that's a classic example of that. You really didn't have anything advanced in finance until decades after the customs union was created. Yet Asia has been working on this financial crisis at the same time it's been deep integration. Now, part of this might be a coincidence, but this certainly is that they're coming together. It's a legacy of the crisis. In other words, I personally think that you can draw this movement towards real sector integration to the crisis as well, but only partially. I think you can draw the movement towards financial integrations directly and mostly to the crisis. Okay, so it isn't, it might have some coincidence, but in general they are related. Okay. Progress to date has not been deep in terms of, there's no monetary union or these things, but there are regional economic surveillance systems that the ADB helped put into place to sort of, analyze and share data on macroeconomic problems that was not done during the crisis. There's an ASEAN +3 economic review and policy dialogue to talk about various financial monetary issues. There's an executive meeting of the East Asian central banks, etc. So these are sort of consultative and surveillance related. You also have some regional resource pooling. The Chiang Mai Initiative is an initiative which is a series of bilateral swap arrangements that these countries have organized. And what does that mean? Well, if Japan organizes a swap arrangement with Thailand, it says, okay, at any time, Thailand can borrow $2 billion worth of Japan's foreign exchange reserves in exchange for baht at that exchange rate, and pay a small interest on that for 6 months, after which it would be paid. So this is a way of supplementing your reserves. Okay, so, and these are done, it's done on a bilateral level, and it has grown to be about $75 billion worth of these bilateral swaps that are taking place. And somebody came up this summer and said, hey, why don't we multilateralize? This is very inefficient doing it in a bilateral way. Why don't we multilateralize it? And everyone's saying, yeah, that's a good idea. Well, the interesting thing is this is exactly the proposal that Japan had suggested in 1998 during the crisis, that that the IMF and the U.S. Treasury, that Larry Summers said no to, right? The Japanese proposed a $50 billion facility that would help supplement reserves in the case of a crisis. IMF said no, they should come to the IMF. And then this is sort of a way of indirectly going back to that same idea. Now, this is you might say, well, $75 billion, they've got $2.7 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. This is a drop in the bucket. But, the fact that they've got all these reserves and they don't need that kind of a swap mechanism and they're still working on it suggests to me a very strong policy message that, look, we want to do things more in terms of cooperation. There's also an Asian bond market development approach. There's an Asian bond market initiative, Asian bond funds, and the idea here is to begin to purchase each other's bonds. Have a fund where you would purchase Asian bonds that are denominated in Asian currencies. Because most of these countries, if they want to borrow from abroad, they have to do so in dollars, or usually in dollars, or it would have to be in foreign denominated debt. That's just what economists call original sin, right? That you cannot borrow money in your own currency. And this is a way of sort of trying to diversify that. These things are still very small, and it's still just government to government, but it has bigger plans in the future. The US dollar is still by far the most important in the region, and this is surprising to some. It's remained dominant since the crisis. I don't want to dwell on this much, but there's some estimates on implicit weights that are placed on currencies. And before the crisis, all these currencies, most of these currencies were fixed to the dollar, formally, of some way or another. Afterwards, most of them were managed floats, but it turns out it really didn't make much of a difference. Okay, the dollar is very much very important. These gives weights in a regression that Masahiro Kawai did on various countries to show what the implicit rates these countries are placing on the dollar. And what you end up seeing is that it actually rose in several countries, like in Malaysia, etc., stayed the same in other of them, and it fell in South Korea, Singapore, and Thailand. But even in these cases, it still had a 2/3 weight, which is much greater than what their trade patterns would suggest. It's a disproportionate role for the dollar. And you've also had a tightening of the range. Before you saw it between 0.52 and actually 1.03, and now it's between 0.66 and 0.99. So interestingly, they're all using the dollar as an important part of that basket, or the most important part of that basket, and they're all doing it in a more similar way. Laos is a bit of an outlier, but Laos is pretty small. Okay. The volatility of the US dollar, uncertainties, and this is as political as I can get, euphemistic, uncertainty surrounding fiscal management in the United States, as well as sound asset management ideas, is behind the idea to sort of diversify investments in foreign exchange reserves, right? That's a cost to developing countries for holding on to reserves. You're investing in very low-yielding treasury notes and things, and it's not very diversified. So if you bring in modern asset management techniques, we should start diversifying. And so you've seen that's part of the strategy has been the creation of these sovereign wealth funds. And in a paper I just did with Max Cranen, presented at the American Economic Association meetings, we suggest that financial monetary cooperation, particularly exchange rate management in Asia, should be supported by the U.S. It might sound counterintuitive, but we argued because in this way you could facilitate a concerted exchange rate movements to help correct international imbalances. So, if you look at these international imbalances, there's no consensus on what level of U.S. current account balances will be economically sustainable. It's really kind of interesting. You've got only two things people do agree on if you go through literature. One is it can be sustained in the very short run. And we know that because it's being sustained. Secondly, you can't do it till the end of time, right? You can't do it forever. Between those two, it's really not clear, right? So you don't really have a good economic way of sort of saying what is sustainable. People use 3% as a benchmark, but with absolutely no reason for that, frankly. But we would argue what's more important here is that perhaps it's gone beyond what is politically sustainable already. In other words, you already see the war drums being beat in Washington about the need to punish currencies that are being manipulated. I always love that term, manipulated. You keep it constant and you're manipulating it. But anyway. But we argue in this paper that no serious exchange rate realignment will be possible except in concert, okay, with each other. Malaysia is not going to revalue if China doesn't big time, and then maybe not. Thailand won't do the same. There's that uncertainty, so you're not seeing anything. Unless you had some sort of a concerted approach to things, not much is going to happen. And a concerted approach, to the extent that that helps solve these imbalances and gets what the U.S. wants, would make sense. So, this would be an argument to support it. Okay, so if I wanted to summarize the general arguments for for creating a proactive U.S. strategy. I'd begin by saying that with 10 salient reasons, the economic partnership with Asia is strong and growing in importance, so that's going to continue. That's a motivation for it. Policies in general have been in the right direction. Economic growth has pulled hundreds of millions out of poverty. I mean, we tend to forget that, but it's an amazing feat. However, the process has also created greater inequalities, which could be explosive, right? So these greater inequalities should generally be something the U.S. would not should be trying to alleviate, both across countries, within countries, but also the extent that they could be explosive, they could lead to other political and strategic problems. And that's a problem. And also it has come at a very high environmental cost as doing this. I think in China, for example, you've got 17 out of the 20 most polluted cities in the world are in China. And part of this has to do with the fact that in China, you have the central government that sort of tells the regional governments they need to be more environmentally aware, they need to be greener, but they don't give them any incentives to do that. All their incentives come through greater economic growth. And so you see this conflict of incentives, and of course economic growth is winning out, and that's a problem. Okay? Fourth, Asian regionalism has been followed, regionalization has been followed by regionalism, which in turn is promoting stability and improving cross-border ties in what I would argue to be a politically volatile region. Certainly was the case of ASEAN. Okay, ASEAN was founded in 1967 and didn't do anything really in terms of economics for another 25 years. Okay, and so some people say, well, ASEAN is a joke economically. Well, you know, what did ASEAN do? It was in 1967. You had the Cultural Revolution in China. You had just had a very, very bloody civil war in Indonesia, which was blamed on China, right? You had confrontasi between Indonesia and Malaysia. You had all these problems. And since then, you've had not one shot fired across the border. Well, you know, at least you haven't had any hot wars or anything. It's hard to develop unless you have the right security and political framework that are set up, right? And that's just one example. There are a lot of other examples. We could talk about Northeast Asia, and I would argue that in the longer term that would bode well for that, for cooperation in Northeast Asia as well. Okay? Even if Asian regionalism is benign vis-a-vis the U.S., and we argue that it would be, there's a cost to being separated from the process, so it would behoove the U.S. to be part of that. Sixth, cooperation in Asia will increase the chances of smooth adjustments to imbalances and facilitate dialogue, which was the last point I made in the presentation. Seventh, regional integration. The ASEAN Economic Community, for example, is reducing policy divergencies in the region in favor of best practices. What do I mean by policy divergencies? Well, if you, in ASEAN, for example, right now, as part of this movement towards creating an economic community, they've already have a common tariff nomenclature. Now they're working on a single window for customs. They're trying to put in place some things that are just going to be much more efficient in the region more generally. Okay, and that's going to favor sort of U.S. interests in the region. However, structural change is not being cushioned by any sort of compensation mechanism. All right, this is a that's inequality revisited. This is an important issue that it needs to be, I think, a focus rather than something that's just sort of paid lip service to. Eighth, Asian integration into the global marketplace has created important allies of the U.S. In international fora, and allowing to have one voice in this fora could help. If you know, it's this idea of being the whole being more than the sum of the parts. It's a critical issue in terms of security issues, each with an economic dimension, and so the U.S. needs to be engaged. And I would argue it's even with the wheels that are not squeaky. I mean, I'm not the expert on foreign policy. Many of you are. But, I mean, when I look at what U.S. priorities are, it's where you have the squeaky wheels out there. Well, you know, it's also true to keep the whole machine running. You also have to pay attention to parts that are not squeaky, and that could be in the future. And I think that's important to keep in mind because, you know, very frequently I hear Asian policymakers complain that they're being ignored by the United States, right? One, in some ways, it might not be so bad, but in others, it certainly is a problem in the way U.S. perceives the region, I think. And 10, supporting Asian regionalism could actually help balance China, and as I mentioned, I add that in just because That's what I see as a perception, at least in D.C., even though I'm not convinced by it. We could talk about that as well. Okay, if I were to give a 10-point review of what a policy agenda would be for Asia in 5 minutes, what I would do is first, I would say I would recognize that APEC is a useful forum for the U.S., but it's about to lose its economic credibility. It promised in 1994, what was called in Bogor, Indonesia, what was called the Bogor Vision, to create a region of open trade and investment by 2010 for developed countries, 2020 for developing countries. We're in 2008. Essentially, nothing has been done. There's been no value added. If you go to what's been done independently, they've got individual action plans. You do see liberalization towards this, but they're all dealing with other commitments, Uruguay round commitments or whatever. There's been no liberalization. So what's going to happen beginning next year is people are going to say, well, where's the beef? And it's going to be a failure. So you saw Bush, I think, President Bush, I think it was in November of 2006, talked about the possibility of free trade area for the Asia Pacific. This is something strongly supported, for example, by the Peterson Institute, et cetera. I think actually, if you look at the economics of it, I don't think it's such a bad idea to kind of think of that sort of an approach to the thing. And also APEC isn't a very good negotiating forum. You need a negotiating forum to do this sort of a thing. So there's the FTAP. And then also there's something called ASEAN US 2010-2020, which is something I'm proposing in an article later on this month. And the idea is that the U.S. already has a free trade area with Singapore. It has advanced stages of negotiations for agreements with Malaysia and with Thailand. They've been put on hold for various political reasons. I don't think it is, given the state of the region at this time, I think the U.S. could reasonably set a goal to have negotiations at least in place, if not finished, by 2010. That's a very feasible agenda at a bilateral level, and then announce at a regional level a U.S.-ASEAN agreement. You can call it U.S.-ASEAN partnership agreement, the enhanced partnership, whatever you want to call it. But the idea would be is that if ASEAN really is going to integrate and become an economic community, it starts to make sense to deal with ASEAN as a region. It doesn't right now. I mean, the countries that have, China, which has a free trade area with ASEAN, Japan has a free trade area with ASEAN, South Korea does. These are all very lowest common denominator, more political than economic things that the U.S. does not do, at least in Asia, in terms of its agreements. Okay? It doesn't really make sense. If you're going to do something in terms of economics, you need to have the region sufficiently integrated for that to make sense, and that's not going to make sense for another 10 years. So it would make sense to have this two-stage thing where you focus first on the bilaterals, and then you look at it from a regional point of view. And I would argue that there is precedent, for example, in the European community with respect to its North African policy and that. Secondly, the U.S. should not oppose Asian economic integration, but should work where appropriate for Asia-Pacific-wide approaches. Some of you remember that when that first Uruguay round died in December of 1990, there was a visiting Chinese delegation to Malaysia, and Mahathir, Prime Minister of Malaysia, proposed the creation of an East Asian economic bloc, right? That, which would become a integrated region. So Asia would become integrated, and it would be Asia for Asian only. And that's where they wanted to go, because the developed countries, the EU and the US, couldn't agree on things. And that just threw, the other ASEAN countries were upset with him because he didn't consult with them. But James Baker just went ballistic about this. He got really upset, and so that really set back Malaysian-U.S. relations. And that's why at Blake Island there was no top-level representation by Malaysia, because they were very, very upset at the U.S. at the time for its approach to that. It was very counterproductive. At least this administration hasn't been doing that, and that can be very counterproductive. But having said that, the U.S. should work for Asia-Pacific approaches. The U.S. should support the ASEAN economic community, and it has been doing that. But it needs to stress the importance of institution building. And this will have political and financial costs to be borne by the member states. ASEAN has tried at every step to avoid paying any of those costs. I mean, just to give you an idea, here's a region which has a commitment to close development gaps, and that's becoming much more popular. And yet, what are the contributions to the ASEAN Secretariat? There are, on a lump sum basis, each country puts in a little less than 900,000 US dollars per year. So Singapore, per capita income of $49,000 a head, is putting in less than $1 million, is putting in less than $900,000, and so is poor Laos. And that's still very, very inefficient, very, very inappropriate. So you've got the Secretariat, which is being stifled, it can't do what it needs to do, and it's relying on foreign aid to help it. So you wouldn't want the U.S. to go in and say, look, we'll take over these things. I mean, that's not in the cards, and it's not healthy. And this has to be applied also to equitable economic development. There has to be, ultimately you have to have programs. You have to have funding to do this, and there has been none that's been forthcoming. Okay? Third, I think it's important that within this category that ASEAN understand that its credibility is completely at stake right now. That if the ASEAN economic community is not pulled off, it is not going to be, people are not going to take ASEAN seriously. They're willing to give ASEAN a benefit of the doubt right now because of the success of the ASEAN free trade area and other things that it's doing in terms of investment. What's called now what they were originally going to call the comprehensive investment area. They decided that was politically probably not the best thing to call it. Working to create the CIA was not something they had to priority, so now it's going to be called the ACIA, the ASEAN Comprehensive Investment Area. So people are willing to give them the benefit of doubt, but that's not going to happen in the future, I would argue. There's nothing wrong with I think it would be a good idea to have an ASEAN-US summit every year, not just on the sidelines of APEC, but something that is up and running, in part because, when you have these summits, there's a big demand for something to be done, to push things forward, to think about those things. If you're only doing it at the APEC summit, you're going to be thinking APEC and thinking about squeaky wheels. You're not going to think about ASEAN. Okay? I think there could be enhanced technical assistance, especially for poverty reduction in the least developed countries. There is in existence what's called an enhanced partnership, but it, through that you could create a public-private fund for soft cooperation and the environment, which is something that needs to be a priority, we would argue. Sixth, improve exchange rate management mechanisms. This is a global problem, but the U.S. is going to have to understand that a lot of these problems are homegrown and need to be addressed at home as well. This idea, for example, Bernanke's sort of saying that, well, the problem with U.S. Current account imbalances is really not with the U.S., it's a savings glut elsewhere. That's not very productive, especially since you can't really argue that with any very convincingly using economics, just by identities like we tend to do it. Seventh, I think the way you could see is there's a U.S.-South Korea free trade area that has been negotiated and is going to be voted on in Congress. I'm not sure it has a lot of, it's being debated. I'm not sure, certainly in a politically charged election year like this year, I'm not sure it's going to go through. But should it go through, that's going to create a chain reaction. Already the Keidan-Ren, the Industrial Association in Japan, wants to rethink a free trade area with the United States. So then you have a Japan-U.S. one. And that, in my view, could be a problem strategically. Because there's no U.S.-China free trade area that's going to be on the books. That's politically off the agenda. And this could lead to a lot of problems, I think, in Sino-U.S. relations if you get all these other countries are getting a free trade area with China. So this is why I would stress China is part of APEC. China could be part of would be part of the free trade area for the Asia Pacific. That's a safer place to do this. Besides, I'd argue it's more efficient to do it there. Okay. Eighth. The economic dialogue with China needs to be less ad hoc and more systematic. I mean, it seems to be, constantly the U.S. goes to China and says, you have to do this. Sometimes it's threatening, sometimes it's begging, but it's always done sort of on an ad hoc basis. That could be done more systematically once things calm down a bit. And as I mentioned, Clinton helped APEC with the Uruguay round. APEC could also be used. The APEC and the ASEAN dialogue meetings can be used more effectively for things like the Doha Development Agenda and pushing things through at the global level. And then there's finally Myanmar, which is a country I've sort of tried to avoid talking a lot about because it's obviously a big thing. But I would say it's important to understand that the economic sanctions have not been working. We could argue if economic sanctions sometimes they do work, a lot of times they don't work, but they're certainly not going to work in isolation. I mean, if you've got China and you've got India that are not following anything, any of these sanctions, and other ASEAN countries are doing it, it's not going to be particularly productive. You're not going to get what you want. So you need to create better mechanisms to deal with this, and this could lead to some compromise. And that's not always easy to happen, but I think it needs to be taken into consideration. Okay, so that's my talk.
Michael, thank you very, very much. Our tradition now is to open the floor up for questions and get a dialogue going. So if there's anybody in the audience has a question.
This is not a great season for free trade agreements. In particular, the current mantra is about labor standards, environmental standards. And I wonder how you see, as a practical matter, those ideas fitting into this agenda, or what compromises need to be made in that direction to make something like this.
I think the more, of course, that's an excellent question, because, when you looked at Seattle in 1999, it was about that. It wasn't so, I know the anti-globals outside are the ones that caused all the got the attention in the media, but inside it was a lot of fighting over whether or not we should talk about things like environment and labor in the Doha, what would end up being the Doha Development Agenda. So it is something that developing countries sort of resist. I think that when I look at Asia, that the environmental aspects would be a lot easier than the labor aspects to start. So I think that in these sort of agreements, including the environmental things, that they are easier to work out than the labor sections. Interestingly, though, in the past, anyway, the U.S. has been much more compromising than one would think. If you look at the U.S.-Singapore agreement, it had to have a labor component to it. But really what the U.S. is insisting on, that Singapore should implement its own labor policies effectively. It's not saying you have to do what the AFL-CIO does. It says you have to do this more effectively. And if this is the approach, that's not going to get riled that much. The problem is, as you're saying, in a politically charged environment, that's not going to be enough from the U.S. end. So that is something that's going to be very difficult to work on. But I don't think these things are that you can't build a bridge on a lot of these issues. I think you can. For example, what's child labor? I mean, I think child labor is something, if you include that agreement, you're going to get much opposition from it? No, I don't think so. If you're going to talk about labor organization issues, how free they should be, that is going to be something that's going to be controversial. As a matter of fact, the AFL-CIO petitioned to once have the Indonesian, the Malaysians, this is now 15 years ago, have their GSP privileges revoked from them because of they were not implementing their labor organization commitments things. And that's when Mahathir came out and said, look, when we were just pulling rubber out of trees and pulling oil out of the ground, nobody cared how we treated our labor. Now that we're competing with you and your goods, all of a sudden it becomes an issue, right? So that's just indicative of an attitude that's like, this is a thing of national sovereignty. And that is going to it's going to be very difficult to work it through. If you look at the problem with the U.S.-Thai agreement is political. I think it really was Thaksin. Thaksin was the Prime Minister of Thailand, who was overthrown by the coup. Thaksin was very unpopular among intellectuals in Bangkok, etc., and obviously among the military. And he was overthrown, and it was sort of like nothing was going to happen to that agreement, while it was thought of as being a Thaksin agreement. Now, what happens with this new government, which is essentially a Thaksin government minus Thaksin, if only in Italy you could have a Berlusconi government without Berlusconi, but then what happens? My guess is they're going to try it for it again, and then it'll be a matter of sort of ironing out financial services is really the big issue with that. But when you go to the Malaysian agreement, it's about other things too. It's not just financial services, it's also about the affirmative action policy. Malaysia has strict laws, and sort of with companies over 25 people have to have a certain composition of Bumiputra, which is our indigenous Malays, in the board, and the U.S. doesn't want to do that, and that's been in part responsible for its being delayed. So these sort of things, I'm not a trade negotiator. They're going to be difficult. I don't think I don't think the present Congress, or who knows what will happen after November, is in any mood to approve these. I remember CAFTA, which should be relatively uncontroversial and everything. I think President Bush himself had to sort of petition to get it through, and it won by by 1 vote, 2 votes. So I think you're absolutely right. It's a long way to go. But what I'm trying to do here is in the presentation, anyways, to draw out what I think would be an effective U.S. strategy. Whether or not it can be implemented, you're probably right. There are a lot of challenges to doing it, as there are to this free trade area of the Asia Pacific. I think the problem with APEC was always that it left open. It was supposed to be based on open regionalism, which was never defined, and that was okay for people that were negotiating this in 1994. Because 2010 is a long way away when you're negotiating it in 1994. But the idea is, some people say, what does open regionalism mean? Well, it means that in a concerted way, we will liberalize our tariff barriers, but we won't discriminate against anybody else. The Australians love this idea, the Australian intellectuals anyway, that we won't discriminate against anybody, right? So there won't be any trade diversion, what we say in economics. Everything will be good. We'll get all these welfare positive effects and everything. Let's do that. But politically, it's extremely naive to say that the U.S. is going, the U.S. Congress is going to give authority to the U.S. administration to say, look, go negotiate this agreement based on non-reciprocal open regionalism. Because the first thing somebody's going to ask is, well, what do the Europeans have to do? And the answer would be nothing. It's like, you want to do what? I mean, politically, that was never going to be a. I really don't. I think that, I'm not part of the policymaking circles on this, but it seems to me to be it was disingenuous that this thing was done. I mean, it really was important to define that if you wanted to go through. And it was just left. Nobody picked it up. And in the meantime, you've got all these bilaterals that are being negotiated and things. So, so APEC itself has made some progress on kind of softer things, on trade facilitation, investment facilitation. It's been a good talk shop for certain issues at the crisis. Perhaps actually lost a lot of its credibility during the crisis because it didn't. APEC is called the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Organization. And the crisis hits, and the press says, what are you doing about it? And the answer was, well, we're not doing anything about finance. This is a trade group. It's like, well, trade, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, right? So at that point, they started talking about finance, but it's never really had much that's gone concrete. So I think that if you're going to do something at the Asia-Pacific level, you got to do something separate. And that's why I think that ultimately you could think at a wider game for this. So. Yeah.
Michael, you spoke a lot about how a good player on a variety of economic fronts or a bad player. What is your sense of what it is the United States should seek from the Chinese in the economic realm? What are the sort of tangible things that you think U.S. policy should push the Chinese to do? And conversely, what things should they avoid? I'll assume you don't think we should have punitive tariffs for their exchange rate manipulation. No. But beyond that, what would you want to see American negotiators do specifically?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. And what would be the best way to approach China, the best way to engage China? I think that the U.S. would do much better in pressing China to implement things that it is already committed to implementing. I mean, if I'm thinking about U.S. interest in China, I mean, where is it the U.S. is really getting hurt? It's getting hurt in intellectual property, for example. China has commitments in intellectual property, and implementing those commitments, I don't think is bad for the Chinese economy, and I think it's good for the American economy. That makes a lot of sense to me to work on that, on those sort of issues. So China has changed a lot in a very short period of time, and it's being accused of not living up to its Uruguay round of session commitments, and I think there's a lot to push there. If you're going to push China, that's where you would sort of push it. Also, I think that the whole approach should be more one based on something that's proactive than something that always seems to be negative. I mean, we always see, that the U.S. Secretary of Treasury is going over there with this negative thing. Well, that's never really worked very well for the for the U.S. in doing those things, I think. Look at President Bush's father, right? When he went to, he brought the head of the Big Three with him to Japan to sort of open up Japanese markets. And, it's true, he did get sick at dinner, which became very infamous, but that was really resented by the Japanese, right? Because of one thing, say what you will about Japan, Japan feels very confident that its cars are better, cars are very good, and so bringing these Detroit people there on that way just sort of gave this feeling of arrogance on the part of the U.S., and I'm not saying that the Japanese market didn't have problems, it's just that even that image was a problem. So I think these things need to be done that's why I kind of like this idea of having a better open dialogue where you're going to talk about a lot of issues. How do we improve cooperation in these areas, and how do we sort of minimize problems in these other areas? But these bilateral, some of these bilateral things I think are problematic. The scientific nature of the 27.1% tariff, or whatever it is very disputable. I think that China is the last thing that China is going to do in the world is to revalue because the U.S. Treasury Secretary tells it to. I think that's more for just domestic consumption at home, right? To say we're going there. The China never, anybody who knows anything about China would say there's no way that Chinese are going to kowtow to the U.S. Treasury Secretary. As a matter of fact, even if it was thinking of trying to speed things up, they'd slow it down because of this. So I think that could be counterproductive, and I think if you really are going to talk about these things, it has to be done in a way that is much less. I think it's become very loud because of the motivations of the people that are making it loud, but that isn't good for building a long-run, solid relationship. With respect to some of the other things, I don't know. You've got this very strange thing happen. I don't know if it's coincidental, all these criticisms of Chinese goods coming into the U.S. As being unsafe, right? We found things that were poisonous here, or this lead in this thing not working, etc. The Chinese really seem to think this is being a U.S. government conspiracy. And actually the Chinese have sort of, we don't read as much in our press, the Chinese have actually retaliated, saying that this cream can lead to cancer on your face without any sort of backing it up, but it's sort of, they're retaliating in this way, and that's I don't know what to do about that, but it's something to keep into perspective. Another thing would have to do with this idea of corruption, and I think that you often hear the U.S. saying China needs to crack down on corruption. Well, that also could be very counterintuitive, because the crackdown on corruption I see in China are just political vendettas spelt by another name, and the extent that you're saying, you want somebody who's corrupt official, this guy was making me mad, I'll do it, be it the mayor of Shanghai or the founder of Brilliance Autos. I can do this. I'll accuse them of economic crimes and put my son in charge, like the governor of Liaoning province did. So that these things end up being more for domestic consumption than they are, and that is something I think the U.S. has done a lot, and it just doesn't doesn't translate well into Asian, if you will. Yeah.
I want to ask you to clarify the political consequences on U.S.-China relations of free trade agreements between the U.S. and states or multilateral institutions in Asia. Because I think what I heard you here, and I heard wrong, was that a U.S.-South Korea free trade agreement is potentially a bad idea because it could give rise to other bilateral free trade agreements, and the one that wouldn't happen is U.S.-China, and that could then exacerbate U.S.-China tensions. I thought that's what you said. Correct me if I'm wrong when I finish part two of the question, which is, but I thought you also were recommending a U.S.-ASEAN free trade agreement. And my question is, why wouldn't that sort of free trade agreement also antagonize China?
Okay, that's a good question. What I meant is I didn't mean to say that the U.S. South Korea free trade area was necessarily a bad idea. The point I was trying to make is that it could set off a trade reaction, because if you got a U.S. Japan free trade area, that this could be a problem for China. So that's the idea here, would be that China would feel very excluded, and China has become very, very closely integrated with that Northeast Asian hub. Japan, for example, for decades, I'd have to go back. I don't want to exaggerate it too much, but the U.S. has always been post-war, since the war, the most important trading partner of Japan until 2 years ago when China became the number one. And a lot of that is Japanese investment going into China. In fact, some of the trade disputes between China and Japan are really not between China and Japan. They're between Japanese trading companies and Japanese protectionist interests at home. In other words, there's a classic case of tatami mats and shiitake mushrooms, which the Japanese government put anti-dumping duties on Chinese exports to Japan in these articles. But the thing is that those were all organized by Japanese trading companies, Sogo Shosha, to produce them for consumption in Japan. You know, the Chinese weren't eating shiitake mushrooms; they weren't sleeping on tatami mats. So really, what was happening is the trading companies were coming to China to avoid the special interests in the high-cost things in Japan, exporting it, and the protection system were fighting against each other in Japan. Right? So these areas have become very closely integrated in there. Now, Southeast Asia is. Right, so that would be the point, and the point I'm trying to make here is you've got this U.S.-South Korea accord. There are a lot of positive aspects of that, not just in terms of economics, but also in terms of strategic approaches. You know, South Korea is very important to the U.S. strategically. It finally has this president anyway is much more inclined to do things with the United States than the last president. That could be positive. But if you had a U.S.-China free trade area, I think China would feel it's being isolated, and that could be a problem. With ASEAN, I don't think ASEAN is seen in the same way by China as being that kind of a threat to go to the U.S. Point one, and point two is China already has a free trade area with ASEAN, which is really fascinating about ASEAN, because how did the Europeans and the Americans react to this rise of China? Trying to contain it, right? In Europe, we had the bra wars. In the U.S., you have this and that. You've got all these tariffs that are going on, Chinese exports and everything, you know. And Italy's been very nervous about that, as you know, for porcelain and these kind of things. How did ASEAN do it? They're much more nervous about China. You go to talk to the private sector. They're very incensed. I mean, I remember in one meeting with a bunch of ASEAN officials, and I'd mentioned that the economic literature suggests that actually China has brought more FDI to ASEAN than it's taken away, and that's what the empirical studies show, because, you know, China's become a kind of an investment link, and so ASEAN has been part of these production chains, and so it's benefited. None of them agreed with me. None of them said, absolutely not, no, it's all going to China, we're all losing out. And so how did they react? They scored a free trade area with China. And now they've finished a free trade area in services, and they're working on an investment agreement. In other words, this idea, let's engage China rather than sort of put it at arm's length. So China doesn't see ASEAN in the same light. And of course, you know, anything that has to do with, you know, China's always nervous about the U.S.-Japan relationship for, you know, historical reasons, and also U.S.-South Korea. And less U.S.-South Korea, but the U.S.-Japan thing is very kind of potentially explosive. Anyway, that's what I meant by that.
I think we've come to the end of our time, particularly since the construction equipment is starting to fire up and make it hard to hear anybody. I'd like everybody to join me in thanking Dr. Conrad.